Chris stepped forward, his head bowed slightly in deference. "Your Excellency," he greeted. The governor's handshake was firm, almost crushing. It was more than a handshake. It was a message. Power radiated from his grip, the kind of power that commanded respect, instilled loyalty, and subtly reminded Chris of his subordinate position. The governor's cheeks wrinkled as he smiled, his expression carefully calibrated to project warmth and authority. Despite the burdens of his office, he looked remarkably youthful, a facade that masked the toll of his political life. Chris admired the governor's reputation. It was one that commanded loyalty from allies and struck fear into opponents. Stories swirled around the man, some so outlandish they bordered on the mythical, like his rumored ability to vanish when attacked. Chris knew it was all a game, a performance perfected since the governor's days as a student leader. Back then, he had positioned himself as a champion of the masses. Now he wielded his power with surgical precision, exploiting the electorate's weaknesses to his advantage. It wasn't just admiration, it was aspiration. Chris wanted to emulate this mastery of influence. Chris had become the governor's trusted ally, his go-to man in the House of Assembly. The governor's words echoed in his mind. "The lawmakers have all the power, not me." The governor confided in Chris, sharing plans before even his executive council was informed. Chris relished this insider status, knowing it set him apart. It wasn't just about privilege. It was about proximity to power, the kind that could reshape destinies. For Chris, every visit to the government house felt like stepping closer to his dream. Chris remembered his first visit to the government house vividly. The moment his jeep rolled into the compound, he felt like he had arrived. Walking into the lavish lounge, he was awestruck by the grandeur. The polished marble floors, ornate chandeliers, and the air of authority. It all felt like home. This was where he belonged. He imagined himself becoming a permanent fixture here. Politics was unpredictable, and fortunes could change overnight. For now, he was content to bask in his growing influence. As Chris shook the governor's hand that day, he felt a nagging unease at the back of his mind. He couldn't pinpoint it, but he chose to focus on the bigger picture. This was the world he had dreamed of, a world of power, influence, and endless possibilities. Chris knew he was clever enough to navigate it. When Chris was finally ushered into a side room off the governor's main office, he quickly surveyed the scene. Two women sat comfortably, exuding an air of calculated charm. One of them smiled sweetly at the governor. "See you later," she cooed before leaving, her voice dripping with intent. The second woman casually ran a manicured finger along the governor's knee, a bold and suggestive gesture. Chris felt a momentary twinge of interest, but quickly masked his reaction. He wasn't surprised. This was the reality of politics, a world where power and privilege attracted such indulgences. Chris's gaze shifted to Dan Ndu-Aye, the governor's brother-in-law, seated in the corner. Dan epitomized what it meant to be in the governor's inner circle, loyal, silent, and heavily rewarded. Chris understood the arrangement. Dan didn't ask questions or challenge the governor's actions. In return, lucrative contracts in oil and road construction kept Dan flush with wealth. His lifestyle, sports cars, yachts, and impunity from anti-corruption agencies was evidence of the governor's protective reach. It was a small price to pay, Chris thought. Chris could only think of how fortunate he was. The governor had brought him into this exclusive circle, and now Chris stood at the precipice of wealth and influence. The promise of a financial windfall loomed large in his mind. His metaphorical bullion van was on its way, and Chris was convinced the governor would personally ensure it arrived. It was only a matter of time. Chris found himself modeling his approach to politics after the governor. He admired the man's effortless ability to keep discussions light, yet steer them with precision. The governor could stop a problematic debate without raising his voice. leaving people applauding his tact, even if they were being duped. It was a primitive and tragic system, Chris thought, but it worked. The governor's strategies weren't limited to persuasion. Violence was another tool in his arsenal. His thugs and cultists were known for their brutal efficiency, maiming, crippling, and even killing when necessary. Such actions left scars on communities, but never sparked national outrage. It was simply seen as politics as usual. Chris recognized himself as a willing student in the governor's political theater. Since becoming an honorable member, he had absorbed the governor's tactics, manipulation, control, and calculated violence. Promises were made with flair, reality exaggerated into fantasies the public adored. Even spiritual leaders adopted these methods, knowing how well they resonated with the masses. Chris's education in this art was nearly complete, and he felt ready to wield the same power. "Send those girls to the hotel to wait for me," the governor ordered, his voice sharp and unquestionable. Dan, his brother-in-law, darted out of the room without hesitation. Chris leaned back, savoring the privilege of this exclusive audience. Few, if any, could claim the same access to the governor, not even the Speaker of the House. The room fell silent as the governor sighed, his expression momentarily betraying his unease. Chris poured himself a shot of Black Label whiskey, downing it in one smooth gulp. "Oga, I needed that, sir," he said, loosening his collar. "The report from the U.S. papers is causing a lot of heat for me. The state brewery we sold, they want to know who bought it, how, and why the money ended up in St. Kitts." The governor placed a reassuring arm around Chris's shoulder, his grin unnerving, yet strangely comforting. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention personally," he replied with a calm authority. Chris's mind wandered momentarily. Climbing the greasy pole of privilege was less glamorous than it seemed. Those at the bottom always looked up, only to face the grotesque reality of those perched above. Still, he reminded himself that loyalty was key. Loyalty to the governor, the one man who could secure his rise. "I'm sorry, sir," Chris began, his voice filled with frustration. "The EFCC chairman is making a lot of noise. The Attorney General wants to be settled. These people are thieves, armed robbers. The amount they're asking for is insane." The governor turned to the window, swirling his glass of whiskey. "Leave it to me," he said, his tone laced with authority. "The problem will disappear soon. For both the sharks and the fish, it's a race. Let's see who swims faster." Chris felt a chill. He knew his boss had a plan. He always did. "Understand one thing," the governor said, locking eyes with Chris. "You have my backing. No wahala at all, at all." The governor was a politician, though skilled in subtleties and at times in the barefaced deceptions of dialogue, was brutally honest in the protection of public money he looted. It was impossible for a politician in the country to fight for anything else so fierce. His face brightened with pleasure. He looked at his protege as much as to say, EFCC or AG, money would procure their silence. And Chris looked in admiration and clearly understood that in the country, any man and anyone could be settled. It was the best protection, almost like an insurance cover against the most dangerous game in politics, keeping out of net of EFCC. The governor's smile was genuine, his conviction undeniable. Chris admired him, aware that in their world, money was the ultimate shield. The governor's belief in the power of wealth to silence any opposition or inquiry was steadfast. Sitting beside the most powerful man in the state, Chris felt a swell of pride. He was learning from a master, and he knew his future was secured under this political godfather's wing.